I do want to start with a little bit of good news for all of us. We can pat ourselves on the back somewhat. I mentioned some of these things at the climate events Saturday night at College in Marin. In the period between 2005 and 2017, our greenhouse gas reduction emissions in this country went down fairly significantly, about 14% during that period. So that's good. That shows that we can actually bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions. It shows that we do not inexorably have to keep increasing carbon pollution in order to grow the economy. Of course, one of the ways we did that was by substituting an awful lot of natural gas for coal. And that gets us into some of the bad news that goes along with the good news. Because during that same period, we saw an awful lot of new methane leakage emissions associated with all that natural gas production. And the other bad news that goes along with that is that our emissions, while they did go down during that period, in 2018 they're projected to be flat, and they're actually projected to go up a little bit in the next few years. So we have hit, we believe, peak emission for this country, even while the rest of the world continues to increase. That's good news. But in a sense, our emissions have begun to plateau, and it really underscores the importance of some of the things that the Obama administration was trying to put in place in order to achieve the rest of our commitment at the COP21 climate conference in Paris. If we stop here, we're on a path to be only about halfway to what we promised to do. So it's important that we understand the elements of how we were going to get the rest of the way. And of course, we need to go even further, as many of you heard Saturday night at College in Marin from Christian Figueres. The goal in hitting those COP21 goals was to actually set the stage for even more ambitious goals that we need to get rolling on in the next 2 years. So, the bad news, I'm getting into the bad news part of my remarks here, is that every one of the pillars that the Obama administration put in place to achieve the rest of those reductions and get us to our climate goals is under attack right now by the Trump administration. And I want to talk to you about what I see as some of the key fights in that regard. The biggest one, of course, is the Clean Power Plan. This was a goal focused on, obviously, the energy sector, to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 32% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. It would, if it succeeded, it would have taken the equivalent of 75 million cars off the road, preventing more than 365 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere. It was a big part of how we were going to get the rest of the way to our target. In August of this year, the Trump administration released a proposed replacement plan for the Clean Power Plan. They call it the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. There are no quantitative limits in this new rule on greenhouse gas reduction. There are no timelines or deadlines or compliance consequences to this new rule. It requires states to consider establishing standards based on a very narrow and ineffective set of efficiency tweaks at power plants, and that's about it. There is evidence that this new rule, if it went into effect, would lead to about 1,400 premature deaths annually by 2030 due to particulate matter pollution increases, up to 15,000 new cases of upper respiratory problems, a rise in bronchitis, tens of thousands of missed school days, on and on. So it's pretty bad for the people of the United States, but the coal industry loves it. And under this plan, you won't be surprised to know, greenhouse gases actually go a lot higher than if we left the Clean Power Plan in place. By 2030, administration officials, Trump administration officials, are saying that the difference is minimal. They talk about the difference in the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere compared to the Clean Power Plan and this plan. But it's actually a big, big deal. And it's something that we're going to have to challenge. I'm challenging it in Congress. We're challenging it in the courts. The other piece of how we were going to get there is fuel economy standards. In 2010, we did something really important. Following leadership here in California, federal agencies working with the auto industry set a national standard that reflected California's clean car standard. And this put us on a path to achieve some very significant greenhouse gas reductions from both cars and light-duty trucks and also heavy-duty vehicles in the years ahead. In August of this year, the Trump administration released new proposed standards that freeze these phased-in higher fuel efficiency standards for the next several years and take away the ability of California and 12 other clean car states to set higher standards. This is something that we've always been allowed to do under the Clean Air Act. The Trump administration is proposing that we no longer have the authority to do that. Again, they're saying this won't make that much of a difference in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. It actually makes a huge difference. The difference between the efficiency standards that we were on course to achieve and what the Trump replacement plan would produce is the annual difference equivalent to the greenhouse gas reductions of the total greenhouse gas emissions of countries like Austria and Greece. That's the delta between these two plans. Now, you could argue that repealing the fuel economy standards in some ways is even more dangerous than the Clean Power Plan repeal, because states were actually making a lot of progress with power plant efficiencies. We were doing some good things already, but we haven't been able to do much on the transportation side without the leadership of California and these other clean car states. And so this is actually a big, big deal. We will be challenging it in court, but it's one of the huge, huge fights that we have right now. The other involves methane. I mentioned to you that the dark side of the greenhouse gas reduction we've achieved in the energy sector is that we have all this additional natural gas production, and with that comes a lot of methane leakage and pollution. So the Obama administration was taking some modest steps to do something about that, and in 2016, BLM and the Department of Interior published what they call the Waste Prevention Rule. This is to prevent emissions from flaring and venting and leaks on public land and Indian lands. And it was really a pretty modest rule. It basically followed what many states already had in place for oil and gas production on state land and on private land. It requires operators to inspect and repair their facilities, use best available technology, and this is the key, pay royalties on wasted gas. That makes sense, right? Because they're supposed to pay royalties on all the stuff they take out of our public land and not just what they're able to sell to their customers at the end of that process. What a great incentive, by the way, for efficiency. It's actually good economics behind that rule, because the gas that they save through this leakage prevention incentive is gas they can turn around and sell to their customers and make money on. And as I said, it's basically the rule that's in place in many states around the United States already. The industry nevertheless challenged this. They went after it unsuccessfully in court, and now the Trump administration is taking action to undo it. They proposed a replacement rule that basically rolls us back to where we were before the waste prevention rule. We're going to challenge that in court. It's on, I think, flimsy legal ground, because they haven't been able to provide a very good cost-benefit analysis for why we need to relax these standards, but it's a huge part of the fight. Then we have super pollutants, the hydrofluorocarbons, gases commonly found in air conditioners and refrigerators. The Obama administration finalized a rule in 2015 to phase these out. And this would have provided about 4% of our greenhouse gas reduction under the Paris commitment, according to Lawrence Berkeley Labs. Now, much of the industry is already moving towards cleaner alternatives to HFCs, but some in the industry challenged the rule in court. They took out some of the rule, but key parts of it survived. And then came Scott Pruitt in April of this year, announcing a rule that would basically take out the remaining parts of the HFC rule. He actually didn't do it by announcing a rule. He simply said he was going to stop enforcing the rule, which is a pretty suspect action under the Administrative Procedures Act. So that's going to be challenged in court as well. But like so many of these other things, you know, we're going to fight these things. I'm fighting them in Congress. We're fighting them in the courts, but we're losing time as we have to wage those fights. Another front for these fights back in Washington is the attempt to do what the science tells us we have to do. All the science says we've got to keep 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're going to hold the climate to 2 degrees Celsius. We're nowhere close to that, but the Obama administration was at least beginning to take some meaningful steps along those lines. So you may be familiar with the fact that in 2016, Secretary Sally Jewell, Department of Interior, put a moratorium on new coal leasing while we looked at these issues. There were lease plans on the West Coast and most of the Arctic Ocean and other parts of the Outer Continental Shelf that put some meaningful areas off limits to oil and gas production. In 2016, there were new safety rules put in place for offshore drilling to try to prevent disasters like the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf. And of course, there were decisions to deny the Keystone XL pipeline and to reopen environmental review on the Dakota Access Pipeline. So we were actually taking some steps, not enough, but some, to keep some of these fossil fuel reserves in the ground. The Trump administration started attacking all of this almost immediately with executive orders, undoing Keystone and Dakota Access, new policies announced to maximize energy production on public lands and on the Outer Continental Shelf, including the entire Arctic Ocean, suggesting that the entire Pacific and Atlantic Ocean would be open to new drilling, although you recall that Florida got a little special treatment from Secretary Zinke by way of a tweet after he started to get backlash from that. We still haven't heard their final decision on these leasing plans, but we have heard that they believe strongly that we need to have fossil fuel energy dominance on the Outer Continental Shelf and on our public lands. They have rolled back the safety regulations put in place after the Deepwater Horizon spill. BLM and the Department of Interior are expected to soon announce 2.9 million new acres for oil and gas leasing on public lands. The Forest Service has come out with new rules to make it easier to develop oil and gas in our national forests. So pretty much down the line, if you care about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, the Trump administration has taken us in the wrong direction. Then I'll just mention one other front, and that is the climate denial and censorship. This kind of goes to the institutional and cultural damage that the Trump administration is doing on this front. And Columbia Law School did an analysis kind of across the whole of government to look for censorship and other ways in which climate denial is taking effect. And they found over 100 instances of it. Just to name a few, you've read about some of these. In January 2017, Trump disbanded a federal climate advisory panel which had been created to help businesses and state and local governments understand and prepare for national climate assessments. In October 2017, EPA canceled talks by 3 scientists who were set to discuss climate change at a conference. November of 2017, National Park Service staff were reprimanded for posting about climate change on Joshua Tree National Park's Twitter account. December 2017, Trump dropped climate change from a list of national security threats. It goes on and on, far too many examples of this for me to mention, but it's a truly corrosive part of the battle that we're fighting back in Washington. And the impact is that instead of facilitating the kind of leadership that all of you are demonstrating, the leadership we want to see from local governments and tribes and state governments, federal government is making it harder. They're revising their websites, they're burying data, they're pulling back grants for research and leadership in this front, and that's a serious problem. There have also been questionable reassignments of staff within government, and I am doing what I can in Congress to defend some of these whistleblowers, but I'm sure you've read about some of the high-profile reassignments of climate scientists to clerical jobs and so forth. Last piece of that I'll mention, the Obama administration had directed CEQ to develop guidelines for how we would consider climate impacts in NEPA analyses. This is pretty obvious. NEPA is supposed to require environmental reviews, the full range of environmental impacts for federal agency actions, and we were litigating all over the place about how to properly incorporate climate impacts in NEPA analyses. The Obama administration was trying to do some rulemaking, provide guidance on how to get it right. The Trump administration has suspended that and essentially signaled that you don't have to consider climate impacts in NEPA analyses. They've also said you really don't have to think about that when you do flood risk standards and flood risk assessments. And if you want a good example of what that means, take a look at the Carolinas right now, because just a few years ago something similar happened in North Carolina, where instead of directing their authorities to consider the long-range impacts of sea level rise, they arbitrarily set, I believe, a 20-year horizon. Don't think about any sea level rise beyond 20 years. And so you're artificially constraining the horizon to make it a little easier to develop and put folks a little further at risk. Final piece of the fight that we're waging back in Washington is corruption. And I really can't underscore how closely related all the corruption that we see in this administration is to these climate challenges that we talk about. So many of our federal agencies have handed over the keys of government to the fossil fuel industry. And if you want one example that probably tells you everything you need to know. Remember the story about how Scott Pruitt was getting a sweetheart deal on an apartment from a DC lobbyist? A guy named Stephen Hart and his wife were cutting him a deal far better than anything you or I could get on an apartment in Washington. Well, turns out Stephen Hart was simultaneously lobbying the EPA to relax those super pollutant rules that I told you about a little while ago. He represents companies like Coca-Cola, who wanted to save money on their refrigeration costs. And so the corruption is part and parcel of the climate denial and these attempts to roll back all the progress that we were starting to make under the Obama administration. And that's the end of my good news. Look, I don't want to overwhelm you with all of this. We are fighting on all these fronts. And I hope you know that in many cases we have already prevented some of the worst impacts of these rollbacks. We have lawsuits pending. Some of them have been successful. We've been able to push back against requests by the Trump administration to zero out clean energy funding and other things that are important to maintain forward progress. So certainly it's not all bad. But the biggest problem I have to report from Washington is that all of these fights mean we're losing time. And to bring it back to what you're doing here, and what I hope, again, will be a call to action and not despair, it underscores the importance of all of you doing as much as you can right now, right here in our community. We are absolutely counting on you. I'll keep working to get things straightened out back in Washington, but in the meantime, I think one of the best things I can do is support and applaud the kind of leadership that I see right here in the North Bay community. I'm so proud to represent this place and all of you, and I appreciate you including me today.